Mark Ellison was the kind of man neighbors described as ordinary, dependable, and unremarkable in the best possible way. He left for work early each morning in his dusty truck, returned in the evenings with his lunchbox in hand, and spent weekends mowing the lawn or tinkering with small projects in the garage. His wife, Hannah, was known for her warm smile and constant involvement in the local church. Their 2 daughters, Emily and Grace, played in the cul-de-sac with the other neighborhood kids, their laughter echoing until the sun went down. To an outsider, the Ellison family looked like the portrait of suburban happiness. Yet inside the home, cracks were spreading wider each day, invisible to anyone passing by. Mark's dissatisfaction began quietly, like a shadow that slowly lengthened with time. He had once adored Hannah, but after 10 years of marriage, he began to see her not as a partner, but as a barrier to the freedom he craved. Her insistence on saving money, her focus on raising the girls, and her desire for stability clashed with his restless spirit. While Hannah dreamed of family vacations and a bigger home, Mark dreamed of escaping responsibility altogether. He felt suffocated by the weight of fatherhood, and by Hannah's growing suspicions that something about him had changed. Late at night, when Hannah and the girls were asleep, Mark sat alone in the dim glow of his phone. He scrolled through social media, searching for something he couldn't name. What he found was temptation. A younger woman at work began messaging him casually, their conversation starting harmlessly but soon slipping into dangerous territory. She was bold, flirtatious, and uninhibited. Everything Hannah wasn't anymore in his eyes. The more he spoke with her, the more he convinced himself she was the answer to his restlessness. He told himself he deserved this new life, a life unburdened by family obligations. But to have that life, Mark believed he needed to erase the one he already had. It was not a decision made in a single moment, but a thought that took root and grew darker each time Hannah confronted him about his coldness. Friends noticed he had become detached, quieter than before, as if his mind were elsewhere. In truth, it was. He began to study routines, noticing when the girls fell asleep, when Hannah turned off the lights, when the street outside fell silent. He rehearsed in his mind the steps he would take, rationalizing them as necessary, even inevitable. On a warm summer evening, the facade of the Ellison family finally shattered. Neighbors recalled hearing muffled sounds, the faint echo of a scream, and then silence. The house stood in eerie stillness, its windows dark except for the flicker of a single lamp. By morning, something was unmistakably wrong. Emily and Grace didn't join the other children outside to play. Hannah's car sat in the driveway, but there was no movement inside the house. Concern grew quickly, and by midday, the police were called to perform a welfare check. What they found chilled them. The girls' beds were neatly made, their stuffed animals lined in a row, but the rooms felt untouched, as if abandoned in haste. Hannah's purse remained on the kitchen counter, her keys still hanging by the door. There was no sign of forced entry, no broken glass, no overturned furniture, only absence. The silence of that home carried a weight heavier than any visible crime scene. And standing in the driveway, watching officers move in and out, was Mark himself, his face pale, his posture rigid, and his eyes disturbingly empty. For those who knew him, that emptiness would later become the most terrifying detail. It was not shock, not grief, not confusion that marked his expression. It was something far colder, as if the man they thought they knew had already left long before his wife and daughters ever disappeared. The investigation into the Ellison family's disappearance began with urgency, but quickly spiraled into something far more disturbing than anyone in Dayton had expected. Police initially treated it as a missing persons case. Perhaps Hannah had taken the girls and left Mark behind, a theory that seemed plausible given the growing tensions between the couple. Yet that idea crumbled almost immediately when detectives searched the house and found no evidence of planning. Hannah's wallet, credit cards, and driver's license were untouched. The girls' school supplies and favorite toys were still neatly stacked in their bedrooms. No clothes had been packed. No car was missing. It was as though 3 people had evaporated in the middle of the night. Investigators questioned Mark about the last time he saw his wife and children. His answers were vague, delivered in a detached tone that unsettled even seasoned officers. He said he had gone to bed early, claimed he awoke to find them gone, and assumed Hannah had left him. But there were inconsistencies in his story. He could not explain why the back door showed signs of having been locked from the inside. He offered no reason for why none of Hannah's personal belongings were missing. Detectives noted his calm demeanor, his lack of visible worry, and the way he avoided eye contact when pressed about his marriage. Soon, neighbors began reporting troubling observations. One recalled seeing Mark's truck leaving the driveway late at night, long after the family was usually asleep. Another remembered hearing the sound of digging from the direction of his backyard weeks before the disappearance. At first, these accounts seemed unconnected, but as they were logged into the official timeline, a darker pattern started to emerge. Mark had been moving in secrecy, creating an outline of something sinister long before Hannah and the girls went missing. Forensic teams swept the property, uncovering a shovel behind the garage with fresh soil still clinging to the blade. Traces of disturbed earth in a wooded lot 20 miles away were soon connected to Mark's vehicle. Surveillance cameras from nearby highways placed his truck in that area during the crucial hours when Hannah and the children were last seen alive. These findings shifted the investigation from a hopeful search to a grim recovery mission. After days of digging through dense underbrush and remote fields, search teams finally unearthed shallow graves hidden beneath layers of leaves and dirt. Within them lay the bodies of Hannah, Emily, and Grace. The discovery sent shockwaves through the entire community. A husband and father who had once been seen as quiet and dependable now stood exposed as a cold-blooded killer. The motive became horrifyingly clear. Mark had not lost control in a fit of rage. Instead, he had meticulously planned the elimination of his own family, driven by the belief that his affair offered him a better future. The trial that followed drew national attention. Prosecutors painted Mark as a man whose selfishness consumed him to the point of slaughtering the people who trusted him most. Evidence was overwhelming: phone records showing late-night conversations with his mistress, financial documents proving he had attempted to move assets into his sole control, and the damning surveillance footage of his truck near the burial site. The mistress herself testified, claiming she had never asked him to harm his family, and had believed he was seeking a divorce. In the courtroom, Mark remained expressionless. Witnesses described his lack of remorse as chilling, as if he were simply enduring an inconvenience, rather than facing punishment for murder. The jury deliberated for only a few hours before convicting him on all counts. The sentence was life imprisonment without parole. The town of Dayton exhaled in relief, believing justice had been served. But as Mark was led away in handcuffs, there was an unsettling sense that his story was not finished. For a man as calculating as Mark Ellison, prison was not the end. It was merely the next stage in a life that seemed determined to twist in darker and more unpredictable directions. Mark Ellison entered prison branded as one of the most hated men in Ohio. The news of his crimes had spread far beyond Dayton, turning him into a figure of infamy. For most inmates, such a reputation meant danger, isolation, and a constant fight to survive. But Mark adapted quickly. His quiet, detached nature worked to his advantage. He kept his head down, avoided unnecessary conflicts, and gave the appearance of a man resigned to his fate. On the surface, he was another lifer blending into the background. Beneath that exterior, however, Mark was calculating, studying the routines of prison life the same way he had once studied his family's schedules. He had not given up control. He had only shifted the arena in which he operated. One of the few privileges afforded to inmates like Mark was mail correspondence. Members of the public could write letters, sometimes out of curiosity, sometimes out of morbid fascination, and sometimes out of a misguided sense of compassion. It was through this channel that Mark's new life began to take shape. The letters started trickling in not long after his conviction. strangers who claimed they saw something redeemable in him, people who said they understood the loneliness and pressure he described. Most were ignored, but one caught his attention. The letter came from a woman named Crystal Vance. She was 34 years old, living several states away, and described herself as someone who had always felt invisible. Crystal had followed Mark's trial obsessively, convinced the media had twisted his story. Her tone was sympathetic, almost romantic, and she wrote with the certainty of someone who believed she had been chosen to uncover the truth about him. For Mark, the letter was more than attention. It was an opportunity. Their correspondence deepened quickly. Crystal wrote long, handwritten notes about her past heartbreaks, her desire to be loved, and her belief that Mark had been misunderstood. Mark, in turn, played his role masterfully. He spoke of regret without admitting guilt, painted himself as a man trapped by circumstances, and hinted that he had been pushed into desperation by Hannah's demands. He never denied the outcome, but he framed himself as someone who deserved forgiveness. Crystal, eager to believe, absorbed every word. Months later, Crystal traveled to the prison to meet him face to face. Visitors later described her as nervous but glowing, as though she had been waiting her whole life for that encounter. The glass barrier between them did not dampen her affection. If anything, it intensified her resolve. Within weeks, she filed paperwork to marry him. The prison approved, and in a small ceremony held in the chapel, Crystal became Mark's wife. Guards joked about the absurdity, but for Mark, it was a carefully executed step. Once married, Crystal began handling Mark's outside affairs. Through legal loopholes and the remnants of his estate, she gained access to funds connected to Hannah's life insurance and leftover assets. Some of it had been frozen during the trial, but as his spouse, Crystal could appeal for release. To the shock of investigators watching from afar, she succeeded in securing nearly $200,000. Mark had achieved the unthinkable from behind bars. He had managed to build a new life, secure financial resources, and manipulate a devoted partner into carrying out his will. Crystal believed she was saving him, giving him the love and stability he lacked. What she didn't realize was that she had become another pawn in his long game. By the time the marriage became public knowledge, Mark's name was back in headlines. Commentators debated the psychology of women like Crystal. Critics denounced the prison system for allowing such unions, and families of victims expressed outrage. Yet Mark thrived on the attention. Even locked away, he had reasserted control over his narrative, proving that his story was far from over. And as Crystal grew more entangled in his plans, it became clear that the horrors tied to Mark Ellison were not confined to the night he ended his family's lives. Something darker was already unfolding. For a time, the marriage between Mark Ellison and Crystal Vance was treated as a disturbing curiosity, the kind of story that fueled tabloids and daytime talk shows. But beneath the sensational headlines, something far more sinister was taking shape. Prison officials had logged the marriage as routine paperwork, never suspecting that it was the first step in a larger scheme. Mark, who had once manipulated his family and Mistress, was now extending his influence beyond prison walls through Crystal. He had secured money, loyalty, and a legally binding tie to the outside world. All he needed was the right opportunity to use them. Crystal moved quickly after the wedding, liquidating assets and shifting funds into new accounts under her name. The $200,000 she gained gave her freedom she had never known. Friends and relatives were baffled. They saw her quit her job, sell her small apartment, and disappear for long stretches of time. To them, it seemed like she had abandoned her old life in service of Mark. What no one realized was that her moves were guided directly by his instructions, passed carefully through letters, phone calls, and coded language during supervised visits. Mark had created an extension of himself outside prison walls, and Crystal carried it out without hesitation. Then, in a twist that stunned even investigators, Mark's name vanished from official prison records. At first, it appeared to be a clerical mistake, a file misprint, a glitch in the system. But when journalists began digging, they discovered something stranger. Mark Ellison was listed as deceased in state archives. His date of death was recorded, his status updated, and his profile quietly removed from online databases that tracked inmates. The man who had been sentenced to spend the rest of his life behind bars was, on paper, no longer alive. This revelation sparked chaos. Had he died suddenly of natural causes? Was there a cover-up within the prison? Officials refused to answer, offering vague explanations about privacy and confidentiality. Yet whispers spread rapidly, fueled by the discovery that Crystal, as his widow, had suddenly inherited full control of his remaining funds and legal matters. The timing was too precise to ignore. To the outside world, it looked as though Mark had died, leaving his devoted new wife with everything. To those who studied his history of manipulation, it looked like a carefully staged escape. In reality, the truth was even darker. A corrupt prison employee, promised a share of the funds, had helped forge paperwork that officially erased Mark's existence. By falsifying death certificates and internal records, the conspirators ensured that questions about his absence would be buried under bureaucracy. Mark was transferred quietly to an off-the-books location, cut off from the general population, but not from Crystal. She knew where he was, knew how to reach him, and believed wholeheartedly in the fantasy they had constructed together, a new life waiting just beyond the edge of exposure. Neighbors reported seeing Crystal load suitcases into her car, her movements hurried but deliberate. She told acquaintances she was going on a long trip, but offered no details. Days later, her house stood empty. Police who checked the property found nothing but discarded furniture and scraps of paper hinting at overseas bank accounts. By the time authorities realized she was gone, Crystal had vanished without a trace. The story reignited public outrage. Families of Hannah, Emily, and Grace were horrified that the man who killed them could still wield power from beyond the prison gates. News anchors debated how such a failure could happen, while amateur sleuths online pieced together theories about where Crystal had gone. Some claimed she was hiding in South America, with Mark by her side. Others insisted she had staged her own disappearance, leaving him stranded. Whatever the truth, one fact was undeniable: Mark Ellison, once thought safely confined for life, had found a way to rewrite his own ending. His manipulation had extended beyond the grave, or at least beyond the illusion of one. And with Crystal missing and the money unaccounted for, the nightmare surrounding his name was only deepening. 2 years passed before the next piece of the Mark Ellison puzzle surfaced. By then, his story had already slipped from front-page news to the realm of whispered urban legend, a tale too bizarre to believe yet too chilling to ignore. People debated endlessly about whether he had truly died in prison or orchestrated something far more sinister. The answer seemed to come in the form of a weathered fishing boat, discovered drifting near the mangroves off the coast of Florida. Inside lay a duffel bag stuffed with passports, clothes, and forged documents, all bearing Mark's name under different aliases. What the bag did not contain was a clue to his fate, or to Crystal's. Authorities seized on the discovery, hoping it would finally unravel the mystery. The passports pointed to travel routes leading south, with stamps from ports in Mexico, Colombia, and Brazil. Bank transfers linked to Crystal's accounts showed significant withdrawals made in cash at international branches. Together, these details painted a picture of a couple who had successfully fled the country, living under false identities, funded by the stolen $200,000. Yet when investigators dug deeper, the trail fractured. Surveillance footage from a small port in Brazil showed Crystal boarding a ferry alone. She carried a single suitcase, her face tense and determined, but there was no sign of Mark anywhere nearby. That was the last confirmed sighting of her. Speculation exploded. Had she grown tired of living in hiding with a manipulative murderer? Had she stolen the money for herself and abandoned him to fend for his own survival? Or, more disturbingly, had Mark repeated the same pattern he had with his family, erasing anyone who no longer served his purpose? With no body and no definitive evidence, every theory remained equally possible. Forensic experts analyzed the duffel bag found on the abandoned boat. Fingerprints matched Mark's, but none belonged to Crystal. Investigators wondered if she had never stepped foot on the vessel at all. Some believed she may have vanished long before the boat was even used. Others argued she could still be alive, moving quietly under yet another identity, living in constant fear of the man she had once married in a prison chapel. Each possibility added another layer to the puzzle, keeping the case alive long after it should have ended. Meanwhile, rumors circulated in the underworld. Anonymous tips claimed Mark had been spotted in Panama, working under a new name. Another said he had been killed in a dispute with smugglers in Venezuela. None of these reports were ever verified, and each one dissolved into the haze of myth. What made the story endure wasn't proof, but the absence of it. The lack of finality left people haunted, unsure if Mark was still alive somewhere, plotting, hiding, or watching. For Hannah's surviving relatives, the uncertainty was unbearable. They had already lost their daughter and granddaughters in the most horrific way, and now they faced the possibility that the man responsible had outwitted the system entirely. Every time new headlines emerged about him, it reopened wounds they had worked so hard to heal. They wanted closure, but closure never came. The tale of Mark Ellison became a warning repeated in true crime circles. It was not just a story of a man who murdered his wife and children for an affair. It was the story of how evil can adapt, slip through cracks, and reinvent itself even when confined by bars. It showed how one person's manipulations could ripple outward, destroying not just a family, but also the lives of those who dared to believe in him afterward. To this day, neither Crystal Vance nor the missing fortune has been recovered. The bag found in Florida remains the last physical trace of their existence. As for Mark, his name lingers like a ghost on both sides of the law. Some believe he is alive, starting over once again under a new identity. Others believe the ocean took him, ending the cycle of lies in silence. The truth remains hidden, and perhaps that is what makes his story so unforgettable, because sometimes the scariest crimes are not the ones that end with a body, but the ones that leave you forever wondering what really happened.